In the spring of 1909, the Colorado River rose higher than anyone in northern Arizona had seen in a generation. For 3 days the water climbed the canyon walls, tearing loose boulders the size of freight cars and ripping out entire sections of the old riverbank. When the flood finally pulled back, the men who came down to survey the damage found something that should not have been there: bones. Not the bones of cattle, not the scattered remains of some unlucky prospector. Rows of them, laid out with a strange kind of order, and far too large to belong to any ordinary man. Skulls the size of pumpkins, leg bones longer than a grown adult, stands tall. A burial ground cut into the rock, sealed for who knows how long, and cracked open by the water in a single afternoon. Within a few months, a story would appear on the front page of a Phoenix newspaper, describing a discovery so strange that people have argued about it for more than 100 years. And then, almost as fast as it surfaced, the whole thing would vanish. No follow-up. No museum exhibit. No official record. Just silence. So what did that flood really uncover down in the canyon country? Who were the giants that generations of Arizona settlers swore they had seen with their own eyes? I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And if any of it was true, why does the story survive only in old newspaper ink and family memory, and nowhere in the history books they hand your children? To understand this, we have to go back and look at the land itself, and at the people who were already telling stories about it long before any newspaper got involved. The Grand Canyon is one of the few places on Earth that makes a person feel small in a way that is almost physical. It is more than 270 miles long. In places it drops over a mile straight down, and the rock at the bottom, the dark, twisted stone the river runs across, is nearly 2 billion years old. For most of human history, almost nobody went down there. The heat, the flash floods, the sheer walls, all of it kept people out, which means that whatever was hidden in the side canyons and the caves could sit undisturbed for centuries. Nobody was checking, but the tribes who lived in that country never treated the canyon as empty. The Hopi, whose villages sit on the mesas to the east, have a tradition that their ancestors climbed up into this world through an opening in the earth somewhere near the canyon floor. They speak of an ant people who sheltered their forebears underground during a time of destruction when the surface of the world was scoured clean. To the Hopi, this is not a campfire tale. It is sacred history, the account of how their people survived the ending of a previous age and came into the one we live in now. And they are not the only ones. Cultures on nearly every continent carry some version of the same memory. A flood, a cleansing, a world that came before, wiped away, its survivors starting over with only fragments of what was lost. Hold on to that idea, because it sits at the center of everything we are about to look at. The notion that history did not begin where the textbooks say it did, that there was something before, and that the record of it was buried, sometimes literally. Now, the settlers who came west in the 1800s did not know any of that Hopi tradition, and most would not have cared if they did. They came for land, for copper, for gold, for a fresh start. But as they spread across Arizona and the territories around it, they kept running into something the guidebooks never mentioned: bones. Big ones. You have to understand how common these reports were in 19th century America. This was not one strange story in one strange place. From Ohio to Nevada, from Wisconsin down to Texas, local newspapers ran account after account of enormous human skeletons pulled out of burial mounds, dug up in caves, exposed by plows and floods and railroad crews. A farmer in one county turns up a jawbone that fits over his own face like a mask. A road gang in another hits a stone box holding a skeleton measured at 8 feet, 9 feet, in a few breathless cases well past 10. These stories ran in respectable papers, right alongside the crop prices and the church notices. The people writing them were not trying to sell tabloids. That industry barely existed yet. They were reporting what men in their town claimed to have found. And here is the part that gets glossed over. A lot of those finds were connected to the mounds. All across the eastern and central parts of the continent stood thousands of earthen mounds, some of them massive, arranged with clear geometry, aligned to the movements of the sun. When settlers cracked them open, they often found skeletons inside, and a striking number of the accounts described those skeletons as unusually large. The obvious question at the time was simple: who built all this? Because the tribes living nearby in the 1800s did not claim the mounds as their own work, and the sheer scale of them suggested something older, a vanished people. A civilization that had risen, thrived, and disappeared, leaving only these silent hills of earth and the oversized dead sleeping inside them. That question, who built it, is the thread that runs through this entire story. Keep pulling on it, and it takes you somewhere uncomfortable. By the time the 20th century arrived, the official answer to that question had hardened. The mounds were the work of native peoples, the giant skeletons were exaggerations or misidentified animal bones, and the whole subject was quietly filed away as folklore. Case closed. But out in the canyon country of Arizona, the finds kept coming, and in the spring of 1909, according to the accounts that survive, the biggest one of all came to light. The story begins with water. That year the snowpack in the Rockies was heavy, and when it melted it fed the Colorado into a fury. The river tore through the canyon, and where it undercut the softer rock along certain side channels, it collapsed whole shelves of stone into the current. In one of those side canyons, the story goes, the retreating flood left a gash in the wall that had never been visible before, a dark opening, half choked with debris, leading back into the cliff. And inside that opening, the men who first climbed up to look reported chamber after chamber, and in those chambers, the dead. Not a random scatter of bones, a cemetery, bodies laid out in rows, wrapped in something that had gone brittle and dark with age, and among them the outsized skeletons the region had whispered about for decades. This, the local telling insists, was the graveyard the flood exposed, a place nobody living had known was there, sealed behind rock until the river did the digging. Now, I want to be honest with you about what we can actually document and what rests on testimony, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets twisted in the retelling. What we can put a firm date and a printed page to is this. On April 5th, 1909, the Arizona Gazette, a real newspaper in Phoenix, ran a front-page article under a headline about explorations in the Grand Canyon and mysteries being brought to light from an immense cavern. That article exists. You can find it archived to this day. And what it describes is not just a pile of big bones, it is far stranger than that. According to the Gazette, an explorer named G.E. Kincaid, traveling down the Colorado by boat, had stumbled onto the entrance to a vast underground network cut into the canyon wall, hundreds of feet above the river. The article claimed Kincaid was working under the direction of the Smithsonian Institution alongside a Professor S.A. Jordan, and that what they had found inside amounted to an entire buried city. Tunnels running back into the rock for what he estimated at nearly a mile, chambers branching off a central passage like the spokes of a wheel, and the contents of those chambers, if the account is to be believed, would rewrite everything. The article described copper implements hardened to an edge that no one in 1909 knew how to reproduce, tablets covered in hieroglyphics, statues of figures seated cross-legged, holding what looked like lotus flowers, in a style the writer compared directly to Egypt and to the East, granaries still holding the residue of ancient seed, urns of unknown metal, and in one wing of the complex, a crypt, a chamber lined with the dead, laid in tiers, each body preserved and wrapped, some of them of remarkable size. The Gazette even reported a warning. The native people of the area, it said, would not go near the place, and had a story that it was tied to the ending of a former world. Read that back for a second. An underground city inside the Grand Canyon, filled with Egyptian and Asian-style artifacts, guarded by a crypt of preserved giants, allegedly being excavated by the most respected scientific body in the United States. If that were true, it would not just add a chapter to American history, it would tear the whole book apart. Because there is no accepted route by which Egyptians, or any old world civilization, reached the middle of Arizona thousands of years ago. The official timeline does not allow it. So what happened next? Here is where the story turns cold, and where the people who study it start to raise their eyebrows. Nothing happened next. There was no second article, no excavation report, no artifacts placed on display. No professor stepping forward to confirm or deny. The most sensational archaeological find in the history of the continent, announced on the front page of a newspaper, simply evaporated from the public record within days. And when researchers went looking decades later to run down the men named in the story, they hit a wall. The Smithsonian, asked directly, said it had no record of a G. E. Kincaid, and no record of a Professor S. A. Jordan ever having worked for the institution. No record of the expedition. No record of the cavern. As far as the official keepers of American prehistory were concerned, none of it had ever existed. Now, there are two ways to read a dead end like that, and which one you choose says a lot about how much you trust the people in charge of the story. The first reading is the simple one. The 1909 article was a hoax, or a piece of local boosterism meant to drum up tourism and sell papers, and the names were invented precisely because there was nothing behind them. On this view, the flood graveyard and the underground city are the same kind of tall tale the frontier produced by the wagon load, and the absence of any record is not a mystery at all. It is just what you would expect from a story that was never real to begin with. That is the explanation you will find in every mainstream reference, and it deserves to be on the table. Plenty of frontier newspapers did exactly this sort of thing. But there is a second reading, and it is the one that has kept this case alive for a century. What if the record is empty, not because nothing was found, but because someone made sure the record stayed empty? To take that seriously, you have to look at how the gatekeeping of American prehistory actually worked. Through the late 1800s and into the 1900s, the Smithsonian and the institutions around it did not just study the past, they controlled it. They decided which digs were legitimate, which finds mattered, and which stories got written into the official account. And there is a documented pattern, one that even mainstream historians of the field acknowledge, of the establishment aggressively shutting down the giant skeleton reports and the idea of a lost mound-building race. The men running the show had committed to a particular version of the American past, one in which nothing especially advanced or especially large had come before, and reports that clashed with that version had a way of disappearing into storage and never coming back out. You do not have to believe in a grand conspiracy to see the outline of a motive here. Every institution protects its own authority. A body that had built its reputation on being the final word on American prehistory had every incentive in the world to bury, downplay, or simply ignore a find that would have made its published timeline look like a children's colouring book. Whether by malice or by sheer bureaucratic self-preservation, the effect is the same. The inconvenient evidence goes quiet. And this is where the story stops being just about bones in a canyon and starts being about something much larger. Because the pattern we are describing, an advanced civilization that came before, a catastrophe that wiped it out, and an official history that papers over the gap, is exactly the pattern at the heart of one of the strangest and fastest growing ideas on the internet today. The idea some people call Tartaria. If you have never heard the word, here is the short version. Tartaria is the name of a supposed lost empire, a world-spanning civilization that its believers say existed within the last several hundred years, far more advanced and far more beautiful than we are told, and then was deliberately erased, wiped from the maps, written out of the school books, its greatest buildings reassigned to other, later hands. The people who hold this view point to the enormous ornate structures scattered across the globe, the world's fairs with their impossibly grand plaster palaces that were supposedly built in months and then torn straight back down, the cities with buildings whose lower floors sit half buried below the modern street. They look at all of it and they ask the same question those Arizona settlers asked over the mounds: who really built this? And they answer that a previous civilization did, and that our entire economic and historical story has been constructed on top of its buried ruins, quite literally in some cases, with the truth of who built the wealth of the world hidden underneath. You do not have to accept a word of that to see why the canyon story slots so perfectly into it. A buried city, a crypt of giants, old world artifacts where they have no business being. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now. because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. A catastrophe, the flood, exposing what had been hidden, and an official record that comes back empty when you ask it a direct question. It is the Tartarian thesis in miniature. A prior world, a reset event, and a curated history stretched over the whole. The economic angle is the piece most people miss, and it is the piece that makes this more than a ghost story. Think about what history is, really. It is not just a list of dates. It is the story a civilization tells about where its wealth, its cities, its knowledge came from. That story decides who gets credit, who owns the legacy, and whose labor and genius get written out. If you could quietly erase the civilization that came before, you would inherit its infrastructure, its buildings, its accumulated wealth, and you would get to claim you built it all yourself. In this reading, the suppression of finds like the one in the canyon is not about protecting some abstract scientific timeline. It is about protecting a claim of ownership over the entire foundation of the modern world. Follow the money far enough back, the argument goes, and you run into a wall of buried stone that nobody wants excavated. That is a heavy claim, and I am not going to stand here and tell you it is proven, because it is not. But watch how the pieces of the Arizona case line up with it, one by one. A find that would have transferred credit for a piece of American civilization to an unknown earlier people. An institution with every reason to keep that credit where it was. A story that appeared once, in detail, and was then starved of every follow-up it would have needed to survive. And a population of ordinary settlers who kept saying, for decades, that they had seen the oversized dead with their own eyes, only to be told they were mistaken, drunk, or lying. Let's come back to those settlers for a moment, because they are easy to dismiss from a distance and much harder to dismiss up close. These were not internet posters chasing clicks. These were farmers and miners and railroad men, and the giant reports came from hundreds of separate communities that had no way of coordinating with one another. A find in a Nevada cave in one decade, a find under an Ohio mound in another, a find exposed by an Arizona flood. If every single one of those accounts is a lie or a mistake, then you are asking us to believe that thousands of unconnected people across a continent and across a century independently invented the same specific story, oversized human skeletons in ancient burials, and got the details to match. That is not impossible. But it is its own kind of extraordinary claim, and it rarely gets treated as one. There is also the physical problem of where the evidence went. Time and again in these accounts, the pattern is identical. Bones are found. Word gets out. Someone official, or someone claiming to be official, arrives to collect the remains for study. The bones are crated up and shipped east, and then they are never seen or heard of again. No catalogue entry, no display, no published measurements, just a receipt into a black hole. Skeptics say this proves the bones were never impressive to begin with, because real giants would have been trumpeted from the rooftops. Believers say it proves the opposite, that the collection process was itself the mechanism of the cover-up, a polite way of making the evidence walk quietly into a basement and disappear. The frustrating truth is that an empty archive is consistent with both stories, and that ambiguity is exactly why this argument never dies. Let's slow down and walk through the flood itself, because the mechanics of it matter more than people realize. A river does not usually reveal secrets, it buries them. Century after century, the Colorado had been laying down silt and dragging rockfall into the mouths of the side canyons, packing them shut. Whatever openings existed high in the walls were the ones the river had not yet reached, or had sealed long ago and forgotten. It takes a rare kind of flood, a violent, scouring, once-in-a-lifetime flood, to reverse that process and cut back into a wall instead of building it up. 1909, by every account of the weather that year, was exactly that kind of flood. The water did not gently wash a doorway clean. It ripped the front off the cliff, and what stood behind the front, according to the men who climbed up, had been protected from the elements for so long that it had barely aged. Dry canyon air is one of the best preservatives on the planet. It is the same air that kept the cliff dwellings of the ancient Puebloans intact for 800 years, granaries still stocked, handprints still on the walls. Whatever the flood opened had been breathing that same still, bone-dry air, sealed away from rot and weather, possibly for millennia. Now think about what that means for the condition of what was found. When people hear giant skeletons, they picture crumbling fragments, but a sealed, dry, undisturbed chamber does not produce fragments. It produces the real thing, intact, articulated, laid exactly where it was placed. That is what makes the collect it and ship it east pattern so maddening. If the remains were as poor and unimpressive as the skeptics insist, there would have been no reason to send anyone at all. You do not dispatch collectors across the territory for a handful of misidentified elk bones. The very act of collection, repeated over and over across these cases, is an admission that someone, somewhere, thought there was something worth taking. I want to go deeper on the mound question too, because it is the strongest piece of documented history in this entire story, and it is the one the believers lean on hardest, for good reason. In the 1880s, the Smithsonian assembled a major survey to settle the mound builder debate once and for all. It was led by a man named Cyrus Thomas, and it produced a mountain of reports. The conclusion, the official conclusion that still stands in the textbooks, was that the mounds were built by the ancestors of the native peoples living nearby, and that there was no lost race, no vanished civilization, and certainly no giants. That verdict closed the subject. Careers were built on it. And once it hardened into consensus, every account that contradicted it, every oversized skeleton dug from a mound, every anomalous artifact, could be waved away as a mistake, because the official answer was already in the books. Here is the thing that even careful historians admit. That survey had an agenda baked into it from the start. Its explicit purpose was to kill the lost race theory, which had become politically and socially inconvenient, and it went about that purpose with a heavy hand. Finds that fit the desired conclusion were kept and celebrated. Finds that did not fit had a way of being reinterpreted, minimized, or set aside. This is not fringe speculation. It is how the sausage of official prehistory got made, and it happened in the exact decades leading up to the 1909 Canyon story. So, when the Arizona Gazette printed a tale of a buried city full of Egyptian-style artifacts, it landed in a world where the machinery for making such a thing disappear was already built, tested, and running at full speed. The men who could have investigated it were the same men whose life's work depended on it not being true. Now layer the Tartarian idea on top of that, because this is where the modern movement makes its boldest leap. The mound builders and the canyon giants are ancient, but the Tartaria believers argue the erasure did not stop in the deep past. They say it continued right up into recent centuries, and they point to the buildings under our feet. Walk through the old core of almost any major city and you can find them. Grand structures with windows and doorways that begin below the current sidewalk, their lower floors sunk into the ground as if the earth rose up around them. The official explanation is ordinary. Cities raise their street levels over time to deal with sewage, flooding, and grading, and older buildings end up partly buried as a result. The Tartaria believers reject that. They call it a mud flood, a catastrophe, or a series of catastrophes that buried the ground floor of a previous civilization's cities in a wave of sediment, and they say the survivors, or the powers that replaced them, simply built on top and rewrote who had raised the walls in the first place. It is the same story as the canyon, scaled up to the entire built world, a prior civilization, a burial by water and earth, and a new order taking ownership of the ruins and calling them its own. You can find the whole thing absurd, and plenty of serious people do, and their objections are worth hearing. But notice the shape of the intuition underneath it, because the shape is old and it is human. When people stand in front of something that dwarfs them, a canyon, a cathedral, a mound aligned to the stars, and they are told a story about its origins that feels too small for the thing itself, they rebel. They sense a gap between the scale of what they are looking at and the scale of the explanation they are handed, and into that gap rushes the suspicion that they are not being told everything. The Arizona settler standing over a 10-foot skeleton and the internet researcher standing over a half-buried building are having the same reaction, separated by 100 years. Something enormous came before. something we are not being credited to and not being told the truth about, and the record, when questioned, goes conveniently blank. So where does that leave us with the canyon and the flood of 1909? Honestly, it leaves us in the uncomfortable middle, which is where all the most interesting history lives. We know the article is real. We know the newspaper printed it. We know the names in it do not match any surviving official record. We know the region has a deep, documented tradition of giant and lost civilization stories that predates the article by decades and comes from independent sources. And we know that the institutions that could have settled the question, one way or the other, chose instead to let it die in silence. You can build an innocent explanation out of those facts. A creative editor, a slow news week, a hoax that got legs. That explanation is clean, and it might well be correct. But notice what it requires you to do. It requires you to trust that the official record is complete, that nothing important was ever quietly removed from it, and that the people who spent generations controlling the story of the American past never once bent that story to protect themselves. Maybe you do trust that. A lot of thoughtful people do, and they are not fools for it. But a lot of equally thoughtful people look at the same institutions and remember all the times the official story turned out to have holes in exactly the places where the truth would have been inconvenient. Here is what I keep coming back to. The Hopi, long before any newspaper, said their ancestors came up out of the earth after the destruction of a former world. The mounds of the East held oversized dead that nobody would claim. The settlers, in town after town, swore they had pulled giants out of the ground. The canyon, in 1909, gave up a story of a buried city full of ancient artifacts and preserved dead. And every one of those threads, when you follow it toward the record that should confirm it, frays out into the same strange emptiness. Not a clean contradiction, not a debunking, just a door that closes, quietly, right before you reach it. Maybe that emptiness is exactly what an absence of evidence looks like, or maybe it is what a very old, very patient act of forgetting looks like, the kind that does not burn the library but simply loses the key and waits for everyone who remembers to die. The flood in 1909 did what floods do. It moved the earth and it exposed what the earth had covered. What it could not do was force anyone to look or to write down honestly what they saw. That part has always been a choice, and it still is. The graveyard the water opened, if it was ever there at all, is long since resealed by rockfall and silt and time. The article sits in an archive, read now mostly by people the mainstream calls cranks. The bones, wherever they went, have never answered a single question. And the canyon keeps its silence, the way it has kept it for 2 billion years, indifferent to whether we ever figure out who it was that came before us and lay down to rest in the dark. But the questions do not go away just because the evidence went quiet. Who built the mounds? Who carried old world tools into the American desert? Whose dead were laid in those rows? And why were they so large? And who decided that the honest answer was better left buried? Until someone with a shovel and no reason to lie goes back down into that canyon and opens the rock again, all we have are the old stories, the empty archives, and the nagging sense that the version of the past we were handed was edited before it ever reached us. There is one more detail worth holding on to. Every culture that remembers a former world also remembers who survived it, and it is almost never the powerful. It is the ones who went low, who sheltered underground, who waited in the dark while the surface was scoured clean, the Hopi ant people, the remnant laid to rest in the canyon crypt, the forgotten builders whose walls now sit below our streets. History, the version we keep and teach, gets written by whoever climbs back into the light first and gets to hold the pen, and that pen, so far, has never once been handed back to us. Sit with that discomfort. It is trying to tell you something.